Hello, and welcome to Critical Witness. It's a little bit later than usual on a Thursday evening. We'll blame time zones for this one, but hopefully you can join us and welcome. Well, we're going to be talking with David Robertson in a moment. We're fairly flexible as where the conversation will go, and but we're going to get straight into it because we've got an hour and a half, and we can always put announcements about the show later on. But Dan is here as well, so full show. David, welcome. Nice to virtually meet you from the other side of the world.
Yeah, good day, mate. and also, by the way, from the future, because I'm a day ahead of you. It's Friday.
Of course,
that's true. That is true.
Already in the morning.
It's like speaking with a time traveler.
But not with an Australian accent for people who don't know you. So it'd be good to start with who you are, if people don't know, and how you became famous, and what. Let's start with the easy one. How did you become a Christian? We'll go with that and go from there.
Well, yeah. I mean, we'll go with who I am. I'm holding up here a cup that gives you a little clue. So that's I'm from Scotland. Actually, I'll tell you a secret, and hopefully nobody's listening. I was actually born in England.
Ooh.
But I in Berwick-upon-Tweed. So there's some argument about whether it belongs to England or Scotland. I always say, well, Cliff Richard was born in India. Does that make him Indian? So, but no, I am a Scot. I'm not famous. I mean, maybe in some tiny circles. And I don't want to be famous because that would mean infamous, exactly as you put it there. I was brought up in, my dad was a farm worker. They were Christian home, Christian brethren. I rejected that when I was about 11 or 12 years old, to the extent of I just refused to go to church. I became a Christian when I was 16, much to my annoyance. I fully empathize with C.S. Lewis's The Most Reluctant Convert in All Christendom. And my aim was to be a secret Christian because I didn't like Christians, and I'd just become one. So, but I got outed in effect. In today's language, or maybe yesterday's language, I came out as a Christian in my final year at school. And ever since then, I mean, the prayer that I prayed before I became a Christian was, God, if you're there, you show me, and I'll serve you the rest of my life. And basically, the rest of my life from then has been that.
Was there anything that particularly convinced you that was where you need to, before you were outed or you came out? Was there anything particularly that confirmed it to you as true? Or
yeah, I mean, yeah, there are several factors, a lot of different factors involved. I mean, every conversion, if you like, is a link, a chain of 1,000 links. For me, some key ones were this: I tried really desperately hard to be an atheist, but I couldn't do it. It was just so dumb. It was like trying to believe the world is flat or something, or that Elvis lives on the moon and comes back. Well, atheism just didn't make any sense. And I really wanted to believe it. I mean, I thought emotionally, culturally, psychologically, it would be so much better to actually be an atheist. And I couldn't do it. It just didn't make any sense. So that was one thing. And then there was the whole question of the concept of evil. So evil drove me to God rather than away from it. And then it was just, I would say, a spiritual experience. I prayed that prayer. I came out of a hole at midnight and nothing happened. And then 2 weeks later, I decided I would go to church. And I went down to this little Highland church in the village of Ballantor up in Easter Ross. And as the waves were lapping against the church walls, because it was right beside the sea, and we were singing a psalm, it just struck me, you complete idiot. Of course God exists. Nothing makes sense unless God exists. And I knew that the rest of my life would be the second half of that prayer. And so, I would say scripture, reason, the community of the church, these were all significant factors in my coming to faith in Christ. But ultimately, it is the Holy Spirit. No one can see the kingdom of God unless they're born of the Spirit of God.
I'd be interested, just before I was going to talk about something else, but just as you mentioned it, you said you described your sort of view essentially of atheism as kind of untenable. Do you still consider that the case now? I mean,
Yes.
do you not? You've debated, a lot of atheists, quite, intellectuals and things like that. Do you still don't consider it a sort of tenable view at all?
No, ultimately, no. I think, there are very, very nice people who believe very bizarre things, and atheism is one of them. And so Psalm 14, verse 1, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. To me, believing that there is no God is the equivalent of me getting myself into a condition where I believe that my wife doesn't exist. And also you can doubt your own existence. I think the intellectual case for atheism is incredibly weak. Within certain parameters it works, but you have to have those parameters, and the parameters are naturalism. You basically have to ignore morality as anything other than a social construct. So if you want to exclude anything beyond the material, and if you want to exclude any idea of absolute morality, and also if you want to get rid of beauty, then sure, you can be an atheist. But if you accept that there is morality, that there is beauty, and that there is something beyond the material, then atheism doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Go on, Phil.
No, you had a question lined up.
I was going to say, I became a Christian in 2005. I think I first heard of you in 2006 or 2007 when you published the Dawkins Letters. My understanding, I think, because you used to post quite frequently on Richard Dawkins Foundation, wasn't it? His website, the website and forum there. I'd be interested to know what led you to write that book, and it seems like a lot of the book kind of stirred up a lot of anger. You didn't seem particularly well liked by the online atheist community. Is there any sort of particular reason why that's the case?
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you question any fundamentalist, they tend to get very upset, because it's an emotional thing. What I called the NFA, the New Fundamentalist Atheism, was not an intellectual thing. It was primarily, I used intellect. I'm not saying that we were, completely dumb or anything like that, but it was primarily an emotional reaction. And Dawkins' website itself was like a kind of recovery center for ex-religious people. I remember one absolutely fascinating thing. I'll tell you why I wrote the Dawkins Letters in a moment, but I was down in Cambridge and I was speaking at a bookstore when Borders was around. And I just happened to mention that there were an awful lot of angry atheists. And this man stood up, and I didn't realize at the time he was apparently a lecturer. And he stood up and he started shouting at me, "What do you mean we get angry? We don't get angry. What are you talking about, you idiot?" And he yelled at me for 2 minutes. I couldn't believe it. I was there just praying, "Lord, thank you so much. Keep it coming." And at one point, one of his friends said to him, "Sit down, you fool, and shut up. You've just proved his point." And afterwards, at the end, he came up to speak to me, and kudos to him. He said, "Look, I want to apologize. I don't know what got into me." And I said to him, "Listen, mate, thank you so much. Do you want to come to every speaking event I do and just do the same thing?" Because he was just so angry, and that anger is really quite astonishing. I described it in this way. I wrote the Dawkins Letters because I went into a bookstore and saw Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, and I thought, okay, I'd read Dawkins. I knew he hated religion. And I actually at the time thought, I have to read this book with as open a mind as possible. And maybe he'll destroy my faith, maybe. And so I opened it with fear and trepidation. I didn't actually buy it. I just, this sounds so mean, doesn't it? I got myself a coffee and sat in the coffee part of the bookstore and read chapter 1. And then I was so amazed by how dumb it was, how shallow. And it wasn't just me saying this. Prospect magazine, who had him as one of the top 3 intellectuals in the world, basically said, how could he write such a dumb book about religion? We always knew he had a book about religion, but not one this bad. So I started writing notes down, and then I went off and I wrote an open letter. And I came back, by the way, I spent far more on coffee than I did if I'd just bought the book, because every day I came back, read a chapter, had a coffee, and wrote some notes. And since then, I bought about 3 copies of the book. But I wrote an open letter on the Free Church website. Now, what astounded me, this was incredible. I started getting all these emails from atheists. So I was shocked because the atheists were reading the Free Church website. I mean, Free Church people don't read the Free Church website, you know. So I was just like, wow. And then one man wrote me and he said, I'm really sorry, David, for all the things they're calling you. I don't agree with you, but I don't think you deserve this. And I wrote back and said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And he was referring to the Dawkins website, which I then went to and saw that the editor had posted. I did it as a form, an open letter. So I did an open letter to Dawkins, which is a stylistic device. And I didn't expect him to read it, didn't expect anyone really, not many people to read it. It was just helping me think through things because that's how I do things. And it had 600 comments after it. And I was an idiot. I started replying to them. Now, a third of them, you know what it's like on social media. Don't get involved in this stuff. Well, I didn't know. I was young and naive. Well, it was 2007, 2008. And, you know, I was that guy on the poster who's shouting up to his wife at 2 o'clock in the morning, don't worry, dear, I'll be up soon. Just someone wrong on the internet. You know? And I mean, I would say about a third of them were reasonable criticisms. I would say a third were, whoa, that's a bit much. But a third were, to me, as if I'd gone on to the Al-Qaeda website and criticized Mohammed or something. You know, it was astonishing, the emotional reaction. So, but I'm a Scot, and we have a word that's called thrown. So I thought, no, you scumbags, you're not getting away with this. So I just kept replying. And Dawkins banned me, which was hilarious. You know, the center of clear thinking and so on. I mean, I wasn't being rude to people or anything like that, though I did have some fun with some of them. You know, like the guy who said, I can't argue with you because I can only argue with people who are intelligent, and intelligent people don't believe in God. So when I suggested to him that was a bit of a circular argument, he didn't know what a circular argument was. You know, so, I mean, what can you do with that kind of stuff? But I then thought, no, you're not getting away with this. So I decided I would take my notes, and I wrote a letter in response to every single one of Dawkins' chapters in that book. And then Christian Focus said, look, can you publish? I said, when do you want it? They said, can you get it done for us by the end of December? I said, you want me to write a book in a month? Or less than a month? But I did. And I remember it was one of the most incredible experiences of my life, because it was very much a spiritual battle as well. And then it was published. And, you know, one, I'm not famous. Nobody knows me. No, you know. And then for some bizarre reason, it took off. I mean, it sold really well in secular bookshops. I mean, I became very interested in the book industry. And I discovered in 2007, there were 180,000 books published in the UK alone. Can you imagine that? 180,000. Only 7,000 of them sold more than 3,000 copies. And I think the Dawkins Letters sold about 50,000. And it was translated into different languages. But it's not so much that it's sold, it's where it's sold and what it got me into. So Borders bookstores, for example, when they existed, they insisted to their managers that I be asked to speak, because when I went to speak at them, the events were always packed out. And it wasn't because anyone knew me. It was because the subject was so interesting. In fact, I'll just tell you one story about that, and then you come back. But I went down to Birmingham in the Bull Ring, and there was a massive store there. And it was just before Christmas. And the book manager obviously didn't want us there. And she put us down in the basement and put out 10 chairs. And I said to her, no, you're going to need more than that, because a couple of churches have invited. I said, you're going to need at least 50. And she looked at me and she said, David, we had Lawrence Delagio, the England rugby captain. We had Nigella, you know, our top selling book here is Nigella's cookbook. We had Nigella last week. Both of them had 50 people. And I said, okay, let me finish the sentence. You're an unknown Scottish Presbyterian pleb. You know, why would anyone come? Anyway, about 180 seats later, when they kept putting out more seats and more seats, she called in security. And afterwards, she said to me, that was unbelievable. Never seen anything like that. She said, after I got over my shock, I thought, well, it's just rent a mob from the church. And I said, well, no, you were right. At least half the people there were church people. He says, yeah, but it's the other half. Every question you got was hostile. He said, I've never seen anything like that. He said, I loved it. And I'll tell you what I'm going to do. As our Christmas special, I'm going to bundle Dawkins' book with yours. So I just love that. That was just
amazing.
That gives you. So that's how I got involved in all this stuff.
Cool.
Do you still spend much time arguing with atheists online?
No. I for a few years I was on the Scottish Secular Society, and that was mainly because they were so abusive that it made me look good. So I mean, anything that makes me look good, I'll go for. But no, I mean, my aim was not to upset atheists, to be honest. My aim, people used to say to me, "You must hate Richard Dawkins." I said, "You're kidding me. I love him." Because I think at the time I said, I've counted, around 30,000 people I've been able to communicate the gospel to directly. In other words, I mean by, remember the old days when we had face-to-face meetings? People were actually in the room. Well, when in that golden age of yore, I found it just incredible. So no, I was very grateful to him, and and he's still on my prayer list. I still pray for him. So, but what I do now, I'm happy to, but I have to say this: I find that atheists generally struggle with a lot of these different kind of arguments. I think the new atheism has become old and become quite stale, and is sort of out of fashion with a lot of people. I think I'm more dealing with agnosticism, or to be honest, hostility to Christianity, and especially hostility to biblical Christianity.
Yeah. So I think that was kind of a natural segue. I mean, be interested just to kind of talk that distance between then and now. So if atheism's become stale in that sense, like what are you seeing that's replacing it, I guess? What is... Yeah, maybe unpack that a little bit more. What do you mean by backlash against biblical Christianity and that kind of thing that you're seeing in culture at the moment?
Okay, I think where we're at, I mean, I discovered that Dawkins wrote the God Delusion, not because of 9/11, but when he discovered that a considerable number of students in his university in Oxford were at least theists, were Christians or Muslims. In fact, I got a lovely email once from a Muslim and a Christian together who said, "Please don't tell the boss and never use our names," which I didn't, which I thought was also quite sad that they felt this. But they were in one of Dawkins' students, and they said, "We're believers," and they'd been, hand selected for their intelligence and all that kind of stuff. So there was that hostility, there was that new atheist fundamentalism and that anger, and it's still there a bit amongst some of the elites.
Yep.
But I think what's happened, and one of the things that we learned to do was quite simple. In the postmodern concept of a marketplace of ideas, we have as much right to have our idea as anyone else. And I think what we've got now is a kind of soft atheism, or no, let me put it another way. I'll call it a functional atheism. So people don't care if you believe in God or if you have a particular religion, in the same way as they don't care as long as it's like belonging to a line dancing society or a Trekkie club or something like that. So you do whatever you want, but just don't let it have any impact upon your life or anyone else's life. And they also really, really like the idea of a compromised Christianity. In other words, where you wear the badge of Christian, but you just go along with the culture. And I think Christianity is incredibly countercultural. I mean, I find it really fascinating that people who call themselves progressive and radical are the most conservative people that I've ever come across. They are unwilling to be challenged on absolutely anything, and they are fundamentalist in the extreme.
Mm-hmm. I've definitely come across that online in engaging with atheists, particularly those who call themselves now the term evangelical. There's a new fundamentalism about how they go about things, and just as much as it's difficult to argue with someone who's KJV only and has this certain tendency towards, I guess the term is biblicism, but hyper-literal interpretations, and not willing to recognize that there's a breadth of interpretation across Christendom. they've then become an atheist, and now they have exactly the same issue. They read the Bible only one way. They can't take that they're wrong, and or even that there's a nuance and a different view. But now that they're an atheist and you're a Christian, you're an idiot and you're just wrong. So it's just an interesting transition, that there's a sort of fundamentalism on all sides, but it does seem like there's a progression that if you do come across many atheists online that don't have their own platform and aren't interacting with Christians regularly, generally have a very antagonistic and that flavor of Dawkins, let's mock them till they convert kind of attitude that was very prevalent. It's still there is an undercurrent there, I think, but there is that shift. So atheism was definitely a big thing that the church was sort of slow on the uptake in responding to, and I think Dawkins Letters worked quite well because it was so close to the original thing. God Delusion came out 2006, was it? And your letter came 2007.
Yeah. Alistair McGrath had, I spoke to Alistair about it. It was interesting because both he and John Lennox said, well, you've identified a market we didn't know existed. Because I did actually write the book for my friends who weren't Christians. Yeah. I find a lot of Christian books, even Christian apologetic books or evangelistic books, are actually written for Christians.
Yeah.
And in particular in the US, when the Dawkins Letters, I'll let you into a few secrets here since you're so nice and since it's so early in the morning and I'm still not woken up. But when the Dawkins Letters got published in the US, my publisher went around these Christian book fairs, and they basically said that half the people didn't know who Richard Dawkins was. And he was #1 on the New York Times bestsellers list, which to me showed the insularity of the US, much of the US church, not all, but much of it. But then even more astonishing, the largest book chain said, no, we can't use that because it's too intelligent for our readers. And I thought, wow. I've spoken in the US and that just wasn't true. But the dumbing down of Christianity absolutely appalled me. And I found, by the way, can I go back to just something you said there on just a couple of things. One is, I think you're right. I think it's an astute observation that we too often react to something and we follow the culture. We need to be much more preemptive and see where the culture is going. So, for example, about 5 years ago, I could see, because I'd read queer theory and I knew the history behind it and where Thatcher was going and everything, that transgenderism was going to be the issue for the next 10 years. And when I said it, people said, you're crazy. Well, nobody's saying that now. I'm not claiming to be a prophet. It just seemed to me to be a fairly obvious next step. And I think that as well as, and one other thing is a bit bitty, but one other thing that you mentioned about the literalism, first of all, I'm shocked that you don't think that the King James Version came down from heaven on golden tablet.
I thought I could get away with that.
That's absolutely appalling. Or you could go the other route and say that King James was a homosexual king who was seeking to stop the Puritans' radical view of church and state and squash the Geneva Bible. So why are you believing this blasphemous Bible? Both of which would be ridiculous positions, and yet sometimes people hold them. But the one thing I would quibble about is I don't think that KJV people only are literalists. I really don't.
Yeah.
I think, well, no, I just think that they would like to say they are, we're just holding, but they pick and mix. Their principle of interpretation, and when people say to me, this is the kind of question you get asked, do you literally believe the Bible? Well, I'm saying, well, yes, I do believe the Bible, but what do you literally mean, literally? Because if you're asking me, one of the simple things is I said once in a church and a woman got up and walked out because she was so angry. She should have listened to the rest of it. I said once, the Bible says there is no God. Well, it does. Psalm 14, verse 1, if you leave out the context, like the fool says in his heart, there is no God. And my argument is always that a text without a context is always a pretext for what you want to believe. And so the two extremes are, on the one hand, there are those who take the Bible literally, and then on the other hand, there are those who, for many interpretations and advances of modern society, I'm saying, no. The principle is you take the Bible as it was written. And I take it the word of God. So if you say, do I believe the Bible literally? Then when Jesus said, I am the door, no, he didn't mean that he was wooden and had a handle. You know, when it talks about the sun going down or whatever, we still use that language. It's not a scientific statement of the movement of the sun, you know. And so there are lots of things that I find myself in an extremely unusual position, because I do believe that the Bible is God's word, and I believe it is without error. But I also believe it's much more nuanced than people like to say, including many Christians.
Yep. Yeah, and there's a couple of interesting points that just to make on that. I think we've had on our channel before the conversation of what is apologetics for? What is even what our channel's for? Is it to buoy up the church and make arguments that are just intelligent enough to make Christians feel comfortable, and feel like they can defend their faith? Or are we actually doing? Is that what apologetics for? And it does seem more so across the pond, partly because there's only one real apologetics organization within the UK, and I'd say that was A.S.K, but that was tied to a more global organization for apologetics. It does seem tailored towards helping the church just confirm what they already believe to be true, rather than really challenging and getting into these kind of conversations where actually there are parts of the Bible where the answer is kind of actually we have to wait and see, because there's this many interpretations and no one can really say it's one or the other, and allowing for that as we do apologetics, that the Bible is there to wrestle with, as kind of sake of wrestling with God, that it's not always going to be a one easy answer. But I think there's some quite interesting things in that when we teach or go into apologetics, we can make it seem easy, that you have this right answer for that difficult question. And when a non-believer asks you this question, here's a range of answers that fit within orthodoxy for you to give. Memorize them and you'll be okay. That seems to me maybe an extreme or stereotype of apologetics, but I think it's a danger that we face. There wasn't really a question, that more just a confirmation.
Yeah, well, can I just piggyback on that a little bit, because I think you're right. I've been reading the Bible for over 40 years. I've been teaching it for 35 plus. And it just amazes me. I guess when I started off, I once gave a talk in my school in my final year at school. The history teacher asked me to. She wasn't a Christian, but on how the world was going to end. I knew it, everything. I just knew it. And I think the more I go on, the more I realize what I don't know. But that hasn't undermined my faith in the Bible. What it's done is made me realize, whoa, the word of God applies in every situation. I often use a phrase that we don't need to make the Bible more relevant to today's society. It is relevant. It takes a particular skill to make it irrelevant, but that's a skill that we've developed quite well in the church. So I think it is God's word, and it's God's word for us today. So for me, that dare I say it, is a fundamental. I really struggle with the term apologetics for lots of reasons. First of all, very few people are aware of its Latin origin, and they think it means apologizing, and I'm fed up. I'm not going to apologize for the Crusades. I didn't do them. I'm not apologizing for slavery, etc., etc., etc. Apologizing for what other people have done is, I think, to me, an absolutely absurd thing. But the other thing about apologetics is people do have this impression that unless you're a professor from Yale or Oxford, you can't do it. Also, apologetics seems to be a predominantly male preserve, as is, by the way, fundamentalist atheism. It's very, very interesting who their main people are. And Dawkins himself has been accused of sexism, which I just thought was really amusing at one level. But I think there's a kind of cultural thing here as well. in the US, apologetics has primarily been about, has primarily been to the church and for younger people. So in the US, they're scared of losing their younger people, rightly so, and they're beginning to lose them. And so they thought, well, we have to go out and teach apologetics to young people who are going to church. That's really what it was. Here, I'm not sure, you know, you've had the kind of UCCTF model, which personally I think has been brilliant and has done a lot of good. But my particular interest, and you know, the Oka people, I think basically they were aiming at the people whom Tim Keller's Reason for God was written for, which is about 5 to 10% of the population. What I'm more interested in is what I would call pub apologetics, except I wouldn't even call it that. I much prefer the term persuasion, that, you know, that we're seeking to persuade people. Now, my view, I mean, my degree is in history. My view is that all of the early church fathers were apologists in the sense of, to me, almost everything is about communicating the gospel. And, you know, apologetics is that. I just think this sidelining of apologetics into a specialist niche within theology has done a great deal of harm and has taken away one of our greatest weapons. When I look through the book of Acts, I find the disciples going from door to door. I find them in the temple courts. I find them in the marketplace. I find them everywhere. And what they are doing is reasoning that Christianity is true, that Christ is alive, which was usually their starting point. And I think that's what we need to do. So I don't mind the term apologetics, but it's just we have to explain it so carefully that I'm not sure how useful a term it is now.
Yeah, I think so.
So I like your critical thinking thing, for example. So people used to say to me, what's your job as a pastor? And I'd say, my job is to get people to think. And I really meant that. I really meant that. And I would say that's still my job.
It's hard because, I mean, not everyone is by nature inquisitive. And I often think that it's really important for Christians, you know, you tend to give the best answers to the questions that people pose you. If you've had that, if you've thought of that question yourself, you know, so when you talk about, you know, suffering or the Crusades or slavery and things like that, if those are questions you struggled with, that's perhaps before being a Christian or as a Christian, you know, they're the ones you're much more informed about and much more likely to give a persuasive you know, answer to. But I think there is a large proportion of the Christian population who are not, you know, are by nature not inquisitive in that sense. And actually how they were brought into the faith was not via persuasion, perhaps more experiential, you know, not to say that they didn't have, you know, good reasons for doing that, but they might not be, you know, be able to articulate in this kind of philosophical, you know, a language and things like that. So it's, it's difficult. So I mean, apologetics itself would always have a sort of limited scope, I think, within the church.
Can I push back on that a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
Is it okay to disagree with you?
Yeah, no, we encourage it.
Okay, because you know your friend, you know, is much more intelligent. No. But, no. Listen, guys. No. So that's a really, really interesting point. Here's a challenge I would make. Let's find someone. Is that someone's alarm going off?
Let's try to work out whose phone that is.
It's not mine.
It's no mine. I plead innocent.
We've got something going on.
Yeah, sorry about that. Going on there. Yeah, no worries. So what I would simply say is this. Look, I challenge. Name me somebody who became a Christian who didn't come by persuasion. That's the first thing. I think that's almost impossible, because I think I'm probably using a wider definition. Secondly, I don't agree that people by nature are not inquisitive. Every child I know is inquisitive. I think that what happens is it's not by nature, but by nurture, people are squashed out of being inquisitive. So the younger you are, the more likely you are to question. The older you get, often the less likely you are to question. So I think one of the key things we have to do is not go and give people answers, but we have to get them to question. because have been dumbed by our soporific dumbed down society into this kind of thing that stops them questioning. So
sorry, just to interrupt you there. I think the buzzing, has it stopped? No, I think it's on your side. We're both muted, David.
Oh, well,
sorry, you're mid-flow, and I don't know what was going on.
My phone is. I don't have a phone on it, and there's nothing. Maybe it's an alarm. I don't know. Let me just see if I can. If there's anything.
Let me just mute you for a moment, just to check if it's yours.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely coming from your side.
All right.
You're mid-flow and it's just slightly distracted. So it's like I'm trying.
No, it is. It's very distracting. I'm just trying to work out what it is. I've got nothing on. There's nothing. Hang on. Right, got it. I did work it out. It was a time. It was a timer. It was a timer saying stop. You've had enough of these guys. No. But look, we're dealing with something here that's really important for critical thinking. Here in Sydney, I often get asked to go to churches where people will do series of questions non-Christians ask. The only problem is that sometimes half of the questions are not questions I hear non-Christians ask. Mm-hmm. So one of the key things that we have to do is learn to listen to people. So that's why, I read a lot and talk a lot to non-Christians and to other groups as well. So, I think people are by nature inquisitive. I think we live in a culture which, like, for example, education. My experience of education was that largely we were taught how to think, not what to think. My view today is that education in the UK is so dumbed down, particularly higher education, that rather than universities, they've become monoversities, and that it's all about indoctrination, to be honest. And I don't think the church should be about indoctrination. I think we should get people to question. And I think if you look at what Paul did, if you look at what the early church did, that's what we should do. That doesn't mean that it has to be academic, discussions. It can be. And, we want more Christians to be academic in lots of ways. But I'll tell you this, it does mean that we have to be literate. And it does mean that we have to think. So I refuse to accept that people, I think if you don't think, you're brain dead and you're dead. I refuse to accept that people don't think. And let me add just one other thing. I've been interviewed by, top-notch journalists from the Times, the BBC, and of course yourselves. And
I appreciate that.
And, I would say I've had tougher questions from 10-year-old kids from the housing schemes in Dundee than I've had from them. So it's how we express ourselves and all the rest of it. But I think we've missed a great opportunity in the church by bypassing. Was it Lloyd Jones who said that preaching, that God spoke to our hearts, but he did so through the mind? I think to a large extent, the evangelical church has reversed that. And we think we get to the mind through the heart. And I'm saying, no, that's not how it works. So I'm not when you say apologetics, it gives this idea of a kind of cold intellectualism. I'm not that at all. In fact, that's what gets me in trouble, because I can be too passionate and people don't understand, that. That's why I get on well in Australia, because, you can be as rude as you like to them and they just think that's fun. Whereas in the States, people took it far too seriously. But also people don't like the passion. They really don't. They want you to just, cool it down, chill a wee bit and all that kind of stuff, and say, well, how can I chill about something that's so important?
Yeah.
Well, to push back on your pushback, I didn't say that that by nature we're not inquisitive. I said that some people within the church are not inquisitive, and I think that's largely self-evident. In the sense that you stop being inquisitive. Like you said, children are very inquisitive. They ask great questions. That's often why magicians like to practice their tricks, in front of children, because they're very observant and ask a lot of questions. But a lot of adults stop being inquisitive. You stop being inquisitive when you stop asking questions. And a lot of adults have developed a practice of not asking questions, and therefore by definition not inquisitive. And because a lot of Christians, they bring that into the church. You have a lot of Christians who are not inquisitive. They're happy to with the essentials, but are not particularly interested in asking more critical questions and going further, asking tough questions, reflecting on things, because they have developed that habit. But I do agree with you. We are by nature inquisitive, but it takes effort to taught that, to stop that being the case. In terms of persuasion, again, if you're talking about, I think you're thinking more broadly in terms of, I was thinking more sort of verbal persuasion, but I think a lot of people's, salvation often does begin, as I said, some people, Christ is revealed to them in a dream. I had more that in mind in terms of some people's sort of an experience rather than I became a Christian because, I was going to say the ontological argument. No one's ever become a Christian because of the ontological argument, but the moral argument, or the historical case for the resurrection or something like that. And sometimes, I think most often it's a mixture. And I have, my experience is very much similar to yours. Actually, it was both that it made sense of my experience. I like, what Immanuel Kant said. The moral law the moral law within me and the starry skies above me type thing, plus an experience.
So you've got C.S. Lewis as, I'm an experiential Christian. I agree very much with what you've just said. Although I'll still come back to this. So I've had people come, actually often Muslims as well, and said, I had a dream, or this happened to me. And what I described to you in terms of my own conversion, it was in the sense of sitting in that church, having that awareness. It was a deeply spiritual thing. But you ask why? What does it mean? So you have a dream. Is that dream just because you've had too much cheese on toast the night before? What does it mean? Where does it come from? Can your questions be experienced? And ultimately, for me, the foundation is the Word of God. It's Jesus Christ. Often my experience ties in with that. Sometimes when it doesn't, I have to look at that and say, well, hang on a second, what goes on here? Now, I'm acutely aware that I cannot make my experience the bedrock of everything. So in 2011, I was seriously ill in hospital. I had to be given, drugs for pain and stuff that were basically psychotic almost. And so I had all kinds of delusions, and I thought I experienced certain things, and I didn't. I wasn't on a ship, when you're in ICU or something. I just wasn't on a ship. I wasn't the king of Norway. Colonel Gaddafi wasn't after me. These are all kind of things that, if you'd asked me, I experienced them, but the experience was wrong. Now, that's not to cancel experience, but it's just simply to say that what you said was absolutely correct, Dan, that I think in our culture and in the church, we've compartmentalized. We've said, here's experience, here's intellect, here's emotion, or whatever. And I'm saying we've got to be much more holistic. It all goes together. And that for me is the absolute key.
Just, I know we're going to segue to something different in a sec, but what I was interested in, when you, going back to Richard Dawkins and the God Delusion, you were just talking about delusion. So what did you understand Richard Dawkins to be saying about Christians in terms of delusion? Was he saying we're actually deluded in a sort of, in a medicalized sense?
Yes, or evil. I mean, in the book, he goes so far as to say that he himself had been sexually abused by one of his school teachers, but that was better than being taught Christianity at school. So
what's interesting about, because I've been thinking about the last few weeks, is that it's interesting how this, we'll get into maybe the culture sort of side of, everyone wants to see themselves. Well, a lot of people. Because there's social capital in seeing yourself as a victim, or positioning yourself as a victim, and it's interesting, isn't it? I kind of thought that the number one bestseller, sold millions of copies, was selling the idea that Christians are mentally ill.
Yeah.
Now imagine, pick whatever group, and how whatever group you can think of today. We don't necessarily have to give an example. We can all think, I'm sure, of an example. And the number one selling book was saying that they were mentally ill. They were deluded. It wouldn't be accepted. It wouldn't be palatable culturally. Why is it acceptable to do that to Christians? For that to be the case for Christians, and for no one to bat an eyelid, because I'm guessing that it's seen as punching up. You can't punch down culturally, but you can punch up. But does that legitimize claiming that billions of people have a mentally deluded?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be fair to Dawkins, he was a pretty equal opportunity offender in that regard, because he was strongly against Islam, and actually got into a lot of trouble because of that. So when he retweeted a photo of a woman holding up in a burqa, holding up a sign saying "Behead those who say Islam is violent," and which. He did get into trouble for saying that. I would say that no, he's not going to say. He's going to say that we compartmentalize and that there are scientists who are Christians, but it's a cultural thing, and they're just hiding from the reality. So in effect, he says much the same thing that we would say in talking about people being dead in their sins and trespasses. Dawkins is. I think Dawkins is a very soft racist. He believes that if we were all, Western liberal, in the evolutionary tree, he thinks that Oxford biologists are pretty well near the top, and that because he believes that religion evolved. He has a particular theory of the history of religion, which is historically nonsense and logically, I think, doesn't make much sense. But that's where he goes with it, and so he imposes that framework upon everybody else, and I'm not convinced that his antagonism towards religion isn't widely shared. In fact, I think it is, and I can give you many examples. I remember one time a student who was coming to our church, and 3 weeks into the new term, her parents came, and I met them at the door, and I didn't know them. I said to them, "Are you just visiting?" And they said, "Yeah, well, kind of. We're visiting our daughter." I said, "Oh, who is she?" And they pointed her out, and I said, "Oh, she's just new." And I said, "Look, is everything okay? Because it's quite unusual for parents to come down just a couple of weeks after, first term, first year." And they said, "No, it's not. That's why we're here." And I said, "Oh, is there any way I can help? I'm sorry to hear that." And they said, No, you're the problem." And I went, "What?" And they said, No, so we don't want to talk about it. I said, No, sorry, guys, you have to talk about it now. You can't do that to me, And they said, "Okay, we'll tell you." And this is what they said. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but what they said was basically this: we brought up our daughter to be normal, so she didn't go to church or anything like that. When she came down to university, we thought that she would, freshers week, that she would, a couple of parties, get a boyfriend. We wanted her to enjoy herself, and as long as she got on with her work and did, and we started getting these letters home saying, "Mom, Dad, I love this city. I love the university, etc., etc. And I love going to church." And I looked at them and I said, "So you brought her up to be normal, to be an atheist?" And it's incidentally, by the way, I hate that atheist argument that, "Oh, you're just a Christian because you were brought up in a Christian home." Well, quid pro quo, it works the same way. Anyway, she, the parents said, "Yeah." And so I said, "You came to check us out. You're worried about your daughter going to church?" And they said, "Yes." I said, "Well, how did you find it?" And they said, "Well, you were surprisingly normal." Now, I wish at that point I'd kept quiet, because I just couldn't resist it. I sometimes my mouth gets me into trouble. And I just looked at them and said, "Well, you got us on a good day. Next week we do the child sacrifice." And they looked at me for a nanosecond, as though, and I said, "Come on, guys, what do you think?" And I know I've met people. I met one guy who said, "I would rather my son was going to all-night orgies and taking drugs than becoming one of you Bible Christians." And there is an antagonism and a hatred towards biblical Christianity that has developed within Western culture, and I don't accept that it's because, oh, you've had control and you've done this. I just think people look for something to hate, and we're an obvious and easy target. You're not allowed to hate other groups.
I think that's interesting. We'll probably go into a little bit more where culture's taking us, but just even on that point, that I work in interfaith chaplaincy, and the sort of stuff that the head chaplain, who's a rabbi, is dealing with, the amount of anti-Semitism has increased recently, and there is definitely that level of hatred for the religious in general, and I think Muslims face it to some extent as well. But definitely with the Jewish communities, and it is increasing towards Christianity, and to the extent that, well, Christians are writing books about it. We've got so we're at least in that front, we're figuring it out, that the culture sees us as the bad guys, and I think it's one of the guys with the City Bible Forum has written a book on that, I think.
Yeah, my pal Steve McAlpine, Being the Bad Guys, which incidentally, just hot off the press, this is an exclusive for you. It's actually sold out. It's being republished because it's hit a nerve, and we are perceived and seen as the bad guys. And Steve's an astute cultural thinker. Incidentally, the Jews, that's a very interesting one. The Jews have always been hated. And I've always been fascinated by Pascal's observation in his Pensées that one of the great proofs for God is the continued existence of the Jews. I'm astonished at the depth of anti-Semitism within Europe, and also sometimes amongst liberal and left. I mean, I used to think it was just far-right stuff, and it is far-right stuff, but most of the anti-Semitism I've met in my life has been left-wing. And I mean, when Corbyn was running, I remember the posters with Theresa May with Stars of David and things like that. I'm thinking, you are kidding me. You have got to be joking. And we've really gone down this route. And, I have, as you know, I've got involved in lots of different debates. And I had somebody who I'd got involved in a debate on sex and sexuality. He's a homosexual guy. And he wrote me a while ago and said, David, I'm leaving Scotland. And I said, why? He said, well, because of the prejudice. I said, what do you mean against homosexuals? He said, no. He said, I'm Jewish. And it's just too much. Well. And Scotland, as far as I know, if this is correct, Scotland's the only country in Europe that's never had anti-Jewish laws. I mean, Cromwell saved England from them, but Scotland never had them. We had this idea of the covenant and things like that. And I was just so ashamed that in rejecting... Scotland has rejected Christianity. In rejecting Christianity, we're going back. We're not going forward. We're regressing. And I think anti-Semitism is a real problem in today's culture, by the way. That's one of the cultural things.
Yeah. I think that even within the church, it's been an issue. We've got major reformers who are renowned for the way they've treated Jews. And so the conversations I have with my friend, Rabbi Alex is his name, and he, just talking about Jesus is quite straightforward. He's quite likes Jesus, but talking about Paul and some of the language towards Judaizers and things like that, he struggles with, and rightly so. And we have to work that through as Christians. How do we go back to the fact that the earliest Christians were Jews? I mean, that's a fact that took about 20 years of my faith to recognize, that I needed to understand a bit more about Judaism to figure out what Jesus was actually teaching. So it's recognized that in our own teaching and our own, even our apologetics, if we're going to use that word, our evangelism is being a bit better at listening to our Jewish heritage as Christians.
Well, yeah, because I mean, I grew up in a church where we sang the Psalms, so, there was, and I know my father-in-law, for example, and not my father-in-law, my predecessor in Dundee, Robert Murray McCheyne, used to pray an hour every day for the Jewish people. So that is one aspect of it. Guys, I'm aware, we're onto this subject. I was aware that there was a question about race and stuff, so that maybe that segues in. Do you have that? Yeah.
I think that'd be so. I mean, let's go into that, because I know that is the cultural aspect that I think is the big thing for you personally as well. So it'd be interesting just to talk about what you faced around this, and maybe some points of clarification. I've got some questions from this article. So what is the story around, just if you could give us like a 2-minute summary of what you faced in the last 3 weeks, 4 weeks when the article was written, what the article was about, what happened, and we'll just have a chat about that.
So I do a lot of writing, and I write a weekly column for Christian Today, sometimes more than weekly. This week they've asked me to do 2. Occasionally I get asked to write for other people. I put an article or something up every single day on my blog, The Weekly. And I was asked by Premier Christianity magazine to write an article on the upcoming interview from Meghan and Harry. And it was difficult for me because I had to do it before. Basically, I was to answer the question, why would a Christian not want to watch it? Initially, I wasn't reluctant because I was going to watch it, but not, I mean, I'd rather watch paint dry, but because I was going to comment on it. But then I thought, no, I'll do it. So I got up early in the morning, very early, about 4:30, wrote the article. It was published. The editor seemed very happy with it. And then within 24 hours, to cut a long story short, it was cancelled with an apology, in effect, for it being a racist article. You know, the usual language, it's hurt people, I just couldn't believe it. And because I used one phrase that Meghan played the race card, and she did. You know, I mean, the fact that it was true was irrelevant. It's just that this phrase offended some people. And at that point, what can you do? I mean, for me, it was a really bad thing, because it doesn't matter what the truth is. In today's world, I will be labeled as somebody who had an article cancelled by a major Christian publisher because it was deemed to be racist. And there's nothing I can do about that other than just tell my side of the story. But if people don't listen, there's nothing you can do.
And it'd just be interesting to sort of clarify on that, because there was 2 points that I picked up in some of the conversations. Was not just so I want to sort of pick that phrase up a little bit in a moment, but there was also sort of mental health stuff that was picked up in your article. I was just wondering, maybe we touch on that first, because you've written that's right, it was about Meghan saying that she had suicidal thoughts through her pregnancy, or after a pregnancy. I haven't actually watched the interview myself, so but there was something about the her mental health came up, and that was picked up on in your article as well, or at least from what I read of Sam Hale's article, and I probably shouldn't name people, but the Premier article, that was Apology and things like that. Was that something you picked up on, that people had cancelled you as well for how you'd handle the mental health aspect of that interview?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I wrote an article for Christianity Today, for Christian Today, and they didn't pull it at all, which was an actual comment on the whole thing. The actual article I wrote for Premier, I don't think mentioned mental health. I may be wrong, but I don't think it did. The Christian Today one did.
Okay.
And I would take mental health, also extremely seriously. Although the idea, again, can people play the mental health card? Yes, of course they can. You better give me this or I'll commit suicide. And that's happened to me as a pastor. It's not exactly, how will I put it? It's not, you can't, I just don't understand why we're so dumbed down about all of this.
I think the thing with the why a lot of people took issue with the use of saying the race card is because historically, or at least culturally now in this moment, it's kind of seen as a sort of dog whistle, that someone as a dog whistle to sort of racism and sort of and those those ideas. You know, I'm whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, but that is something that you know, is at least perceived when someone says, "Oh, so and so has played the race card." That says something about the individual, that they are presuming to be the case, that, you know, that person holds certain beliefs about race that they would not support. I mean, on reflection, do you think you would have changed that because of that? You know, could that have been worded in such a way?
No, absolutely not. I regard that as cowardice. I regard it as pandering to the middle class elites. I think to be cancelled because somebody says, if you say this, it's going to hurt me, or it's a dog whistle for whatever, then no, I'm sorry. I absolutely will not be dictated to about what I can and cannot say. And if people want to think ill of you, they're going to think ill of you anyway. So, you know, I mean, let me just, going back to the actual article, which was cancelled. I actually didn't mention mental health in the cancelled article. You see, these things all get conflated. So, can people play the race card? Yes, of course they can.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? So, when you say someone plays the race card, what do you understand that to mean?
Oh, people say, well, because of the color of my skin, you have to listen to what I say, or you're guilty of racism, which I myself regard that as racist. And by the way, with Meghan, Meghan amazes me because I didn't even think of her as being, what do they call it now? A POC, a person of color. I mean, here's a woman who was giving an interview in an area of America that is 90% white, and not just white, but white millionaires and billionaires claiming to be oppressed. And I didn't accept that. And I mean, you can play the race card well, you can play it badly. I think there is real racism. I think there is systemic racism. I don't deny any of that. I've seen racism in many different ways. But what I'm fed up of is white middle-class liberals going around and saying, everyone, you know, if you've read White Fragility, for example, which is one of the most dreadful books ever, I think that middle-class liberals are encouraging racism. They're turning people into racists. They're pushing people towards racism. I didn't even consider Meghan to be, what did they say, person of color. And when she said in the interview, you know, oh, the royal family missed a trick because when girls in Kenya could have looked at someone like me and said, oh, she's just like us, she looks like us. No, she doesn't. And I'm fed up with this judging people by their skin color. I think it's an absolutely appalling thing to do. And I think that what Meghan was doing was, I mean, I think she played lots of cards, by the way. Now, I thought it was one of the most disingenuous interviews I've ever seen. I thought it was typical Oprah. Tell us your truth.
But isn't there some truth to that? Because, I mean, my initial thing when I read the article was, if I'm honest, why write it? Why bother? Like, I actually couldn't see why anyone would, like, the whole notion of whether a Christian should watch an interview with some people from the royal family or not seems to me completely inane. And I don't really care. Like, there really are so many more problems in the world and things worth discussing that it's not something I even really have a view. I'm just like, it's just like, you know, should a Christian watch EastEnders? Or it just seems inane. So I mean, what made you want to even write it to begin with?
Well, I was asked to. That was the first thing.
Why didn't you just say, like, why did you? What was it that interested you about it?
Well, okay, let me answer that. I mean, because I was asked to, in the same way I was asked to come on the show. You know, and a lot of people would think that what we were discussing might be inane or whatever. I do think the royal. I mean, if I'd said what I really thought, you know, in some sense, because I'm not actually even a royalist. I think Oliver Cromwell was correct. You know, and I think one of the great days of English history is the beheading of Charles I. But the fact is, the reason I wrote it, or reason I said to do it, was because I knew it would be a cultural event. And I think you're right. It is inane. It teaches us a lot about our culture. It was an inane interview. I also knew, by the way, the one thing I did, I thought, do you know this? You're going to be touching some of the shibboleths and idols of our culture, and there will be a backlash. I just hadn't expected the editor to be so spineless. you know, and I didn't set out to offend anybody. But if we don't touch these cultural issues, and by the way, I think writing about watching EastEnders, you know, for people, I'd be happy to do that as well. That's, you know, I would have no qualms about that. Are we really saying we live in an age where people cannot express an opinion without having their head bitten off? And are we really saying that we're in a culture where Christian-wise, we're getting magazines and publishers and others saying, no, don't say that because it will upset people? Are we just reduced now to saying, these are the fundamentals of the gospel and this is what we're going to talk about and that's it? We're never going to say anything that upsets anybody. I can't do that.
Just on that point, I mean, there's certain things that you wouldn't say in a Christian magazine anyway, so that they ask you to make sure that your language is appropriate. And I think I'm still trying to get my head around the race card, because the only time I hear that used is generally to say someone's playing the victim, but also it's generally not used by anyone of color.
Well, that's wrong. No, it's wrong. That's wrong. One guy said to me, he said, David, listen, mate. He said, when I argue against you, he says, all I have to do is just play my race, and I get a lot of sympathy. He said, it's easy done. So no, of course it can be done. Look, the trouble is we go black and white on absolutely everything. So people say, well, if you use the phrase race card, then it's a dog whistle to racists. So are you really saying that nobody ever plays the race card? Or on the other hand, when someone complains about racism, are you really saying that all they're doing is playing the race card?
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying it's not possible to play a victim based on and to use things to your advantage. I think it's more trying to look at your article rather than the general trend of culture at the moment. But just looking at the way that it came across in the article was that, and I'm trying to keep to those questions. Is I guess I can't see it, in that circumstance. It feels like you're reading a motivation into an interview that I'm very wary of reading motivation into anyone. Partly because they might be the shibboleths, partly because, well, she might have actually experienced racism, but because it's an experience, we can't gather the fact whether or not she did or she didn't. But she's saying she did in an interview about her experience through Harry, who shared the story with her. So it's convoluted, of course. It's not the place really to air the grievance with the royal family. But whether she didn't or didn't, saying that she's now playing the race card assumes that she didn't.
No, she could have played the race card, and it could have been right. She could actually have experienced racism, and and yet, use that to try and get sympathy. So, for example, as I mentioned already, I was seriously ill. I can use my experience to trump, other people's and say, look, you've got to believe me, because that's part of the problem with culture. Right now, we are privileging certain lived experiences over fact, because you cannot question what someone has experienced. And incidentally, Megan's thing, what I did in the article was I made a series of prophecies, inverted commas, about what she would say, what I thought she would say. Every single one of them was right. People thought I was a prophet, but I had to point out I just read what had been carefully trailed. I mean, the whole thing was, in my view, I didn't say this in the article before, but afterwards I would say that the whole thing was obscene. So, for example, when she said about racism, she offered no evidence whatsoever, none.
But could she? Look, I'm just wondering if it was the other way around and she said, this is who said what on Oprah, like, how would that got her down? Like the royalists, for one, have already called her a racist, or there's the other there is the extreme here who would agree with you that she's played the race card, and this is where I'm trying to find the nuance, because there are a bunch of people that are like, yes, she's played the race card, she didn't experience racism, she's just trying to explode the royal family. I think you're kind of closer to she's played this to get sympathy, which maybe isn't as extreme as just saying.
Oh, no, and she's played it to get money. She's played it to justify herself. These are a couple of multimillionaires sitting talking about how they're oppressed. I don't buy it at all. And also, I think they're using, they're trivializing a really serious subject, which is racism. And yes, she, it's a bit like me saying, well, so-and-so sexually abused me, or someone in that family sexually abused me, but I'm not telling you what they did, and I'm not telling you who they are. The whole family gets tainted, and that's exactly what happened. I mean, their PR people within 24 hours put out a thing saying, oh, it wasn't the Queen, and it wasn't Prince Philip, because they knew the harm it was done. It was very, very calculated. And by the way, I had numerous people write me after that article, because the only one piece of evidence offered, which people may comment on, was remarking on the color of the baby's skin. I had numerous people from mixed marriage families who said that's precisely the question their relatives asked, and they even thought themselves. So assuming that that is racist, to me, the whole thing is an indicator of how woke our society has become and how down that whole route it has gone. And it's interesting because what you're asking me seems to be that I have to take account of and bow down to a particular group of people, but not to others. So it's not extreme to say she played the race card. How is that extreme? It's true. It's true. It's extreme if you think saying play the race card means you're a Nazi or you're defending racism, which I absolutely not. But I refuse to give in to letting people take the English language and mangle it, and that everything I say has to be filtered through a kind of woke sieve so that, you can't talk about male and female anymore, for example.
Just to push back a little bit on that, because again, it's down to motivation. Whether she's doing it for the money, whether she's doing it to taint the royal family, whether she's doing it for press, I don't know how you know those things. I think that's a definite perspective on the interview, but it could also be she's experienced racism, she's upset, she's hounded by the press and wants to tell her story as factually as she can in a controlled environment where she can tell her narrative, tell her truth to be woke. Like there's another perspective here, and I think the way that your article came across, I would say, and I messaged Dan, like we're not ones to cancel, and I think this is really healthy to have this conversation, and I'm really interested in your perspective on it. But the way it came across was that you kind of can read her mind about how she feels victimized and oppressed. I'm not even sure that's how I see what she said. Is like they're obviously let's kind of park the racism thing and go to the fact that she talked about feeling suicidal and can people in their position be vulnerable about their experience without being accused of playing a card for sympathy? Because that's the question there.
Yeah, well, okay. But the point of that is fairly straightforward. You're right. It is another perspective. So why is that perspective not allowed to be said? That's the thing.
Accusatory, though.
Well, I'm sorry.
Accusatory.
Well, sorry. Anything can be accusatory. You can read it as accusatory if you want. And I do love the thing about the controlled environment. She's not wanting to avoid the press.
No, of course.
I'm sorry, but the somebody who signs up deals with Spotify and Netflix and does interviews with Oprah is not wanting to avoid the press or to avoid scrutiny. Someone who has a press office that has, I think, 4 people within it and is spinning all over the place. No. I don't buy into that at all. I'm asking, why does she get such protection from people? It's back to the culture we're living in. We're living in this culture where there's extremes. You're either pro-Meghan or anti-Meghan. All I did was predict what she would say. And everything I said she would say, she did say. Now, does she get to say it? I mean, if she goes into public and gives an interview, makes accusations, says things, is that unquestionable? Or if you question it, are you then guilty of racism? And that's the sad position we're in within society. And it's a sad position we're in within the church. because I got cancelled by a Christian magazine for writing an article they asked me to write, which they initially accepted, and then in effect accused me of racism. Now, of course, we're going to look at people's motivations. There's almost nothing that you write that doesn't. What I'm not is an absolute judge. I cannot say for definite that this is what she thinks or this is what she feels. And you'll note in the article, I never did that. I commented on what she said. Did she play the race card? Yes, she did. Was she right to play it? Well, from my point of view, I didn't say that in the actual article. The follow-up article, or the one about the actual interview, said simply, no, she didn't offer any evidence. And she really didn't. But what she did was taint and damage the royal family. Now, whether she intended to do that or not, I don't know. But I am not going to have myself curtailed by people who accuse me of racism because they're reading, ironically, they're reading into my words the very thing you're saying, motivation.
Sure. I hope that hasn't come across for me. But for one thing to clarify, I don't personally think that phrase makes you racist, but I think it's a problematic phrase. I really do. And I think you can ask the questions you're asking. There's loads in your article that I want to say that I agree with. The idolization of celebrity, the whole thing of this controlled environment where she spins the story, all of that, I think, need to be critiqued and need to be critiqued well. But I'm just not sure about that phrase. Did she play the race card? I don't know, and I think the reason for that pushback is that I don't know how you can say that. Sure, she brought race up. She made it as a, but the fact that the whole phrase has always been, as far as I can find out, is a way to say you are playing the victim.
She is playing the victim. That's the point. And I don't think anyone, and I think to say that it's this bizarre thing that you know, and you don't want controversial. Virtually anything that you can say nowadays will be used controversially. Somebody once said to me, David, you could put up that the sun is shining and it would cause an argument. People read, it's interesting you bring up the thing of motivation, because people read motivation into it. And I wish that people would deal with this a little bit more logically. So Meghan's truth, inverted commas, was that the royal family was racist. That's what the interview said, that she'd been hard done by, although she'd received over 20 million quid. Really hard done by. And she played the victim card, she played the race card. And by the way, the mental health thing, again, Oprah, you'll notice Oprah doesn't do what you guys do, which is question. What all Oprah does is just emote feeling. And I'm telling you, we are in deep trouble. We are going to get absolutely hammered as Christians if that, and I think it has done, I think it's taken hold, certainly amongst the upper middle classes, that attitude. But the mental health thing, when she said, I contemplated suicide, I wonder how many of us have not at some times thought of dying. She didn't, by the way, think she'd thought of killing herself, but wishing you were dead. Have you ever wished you were dead? I have. Mm. But if I use that in an interview, and if I say, well, do you know, Mr. Dawkins, when I read your book, it just made me feel suicidal. Does that negate Richard Dawkins' book? Can I use that card?
No, and again, I think that depends what, like you said, you can have this sort of, sort of existential angst, a certain situation. I wish I wasn't alive, after, during an illness or something like that. But that would be different to something that would be comparatively rare, like sort of having suicidal ideation and things like that. And I'm not sure what she meant. I think I'd understand what she said. It was more the suicidal ideation rather than this expression of, I wish I didn't exist. So.
But now you're judging motivation.
No, I'm saying I don't know. I said that's what
exactly.
I understood. And so I'm not. It's impossible to do. Like it's impossible to dialogue with someone without interpreting what they said in a certain way. Yes. I don't know whether you're right or I'm right. I'm saying that's how I understood it. And I think if I were to write it, there would be things I would have framed it in a different way because my understanding was different. You've come to a different interpretation, and I guess what you said is actually far more is understandable in light of that interpretation. I mean, something I'm interested in is the aftermath of what actually happened. So they took the article down. Now, for me, it would have been a better thing to do, which I'm sure would have been to maybe ask you to respond to the criticism. Obviously, you received a lot of criticism, not always framed in the most constructive sense, from what I understand. Would have been your preference, to actually be giving an opportunity to respond like you're doing now to some of those objections, rather than being, sort of copying, the secular sort of cancel culture we've observed and now replicating within the sort of Christian community?
Yeah, they took the article down. I mean, I can't speculate as to motive. I don't know why. But as someone who's been an editor, I think it's an appalling thing to do something like that. I think then publicly tweeting out an apology, tagging my name on it for it was unbelievable. And, it does me a great deal of harm. And, this from a magazine who've had no problem at all in publishing, for example, Steve Chalk, who I find just enormously offensive in terms of the gospel, and deeply hurtful in terms of, what Jesus has done and everything else. So I just thought, there's a sense of priorities and different things that are involved in all of that. But no, I mean, I find myself in a position that, all of the criticism I got from that was, I think with one exception, white people. And a lot of the support I got was from what is now termed people of color, although I object to that term. And I thought that was just fascinating. And from a wider perspective, I think the church should stop mirroring the concerns of the society, particularly the concerns of the elites in society. I think labeling the royal family as racist, labeling Britain as racist is utterly ridiculous. Britain is one of the most racially tolerant countries in the world. Is there racism? Absolutely. Is there a problem with it? Absolutely. But on a comparative level, and I just object to American cultural race wars being brought into Britain and being used in that way. There's so much that's inconsistent and so much that's wrong. And I don't think the church go along. So you guys are perfectly right to push back against using the idea of the race card. I don't have any problem with that. And I wouldn't have minded the Premier saying we don't agree with you, or having someone write a response themselves. That would have been fine. But just to give in to the mob, which is it. I mean, the article was initially accepted as fine. Nobody saw anything wrong with it. And then suddenly, this is very typical of where we're at today. Someone announces something's wrong with it. I suspect there are articles today and books today that are considered, well, they're fine. And in 5 years' time, there'll be Christians on saying, oh, no, that was insensitive. So, it's like TV shows. Dad's Army, that's out. Friends, that's out. I suspect Morecambe and Wise would be out. And I just don't think we should go along with it. And I think we should learn. There's the phrase, speak the truth in love. I think that what's happening is sometimes there are people who speak the truth in hate, and sometimes there are people who speak lies supposedly in love. They speak it in a very, very nice way. I think Oprah does that. I think Oprah, the theology of Oprah, the philosophy of Oprah, is absolutely decimating and destructive to so many people. And so that's my objection to the whole thing. I mean, I agree with you. The inanity of two billionaires sitting talking about oppression is, I would not watch that were it not for the fact that I'd thought it would be a cultural thing that I should comment on. And I'm glad I did, but I'm just disappointed at what happened out of it.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry. I'm not going to back down on it. It's not, there are many things I've said. I think out loud, which means I think and say things that are wrong. But I'll tell you this, I know I'm fed up of Christians saying things in private and then in public saying something different because they don't want to offend people. I cannot abide that.
I agree. I do want to just push back. I became aware of your article because Ben Lindsay tweeted it. Ben Lindsay is the guy who wrote We Need to Talk About Race, and that's one of the top books I'd recommend to people on the conversation, given that it's not going down a critical theory route, but really trying to work out how the gospel speaks across racial tensions and lines. And his comment wasn't positive like that about the race guide. So I guess just to kind of put closure on it, I would highly counsel anyone writing on that just to not use that phrase. I think it's an inflammatory phrase that just will get you into trouble unnecessarily. And I think you could critique Harry and Meghan in the thing that I'm finding is the stuff that I agree with that is bad taste. These two seem to portray a perspective on themselves. They want the world to believe that yes, they're hard done by, yes, they're being hounded by the press, but here I am with all these things that I can control because I've got the money to spin this story. So there's stuff I really can agree with, but then I guess just as a kind of final closure on this article from my perspective is just that the tone of it just seemed to come across really like you woken up at 4:30 and rushed off an article. It just seemed to
no, but listen, but you can't. I'm not going to let you away with that though, because what you've just said to me is that I can mention everything except the one thing, the main thing that she uses to gain sympathy and which causes all this fuss. Now, if I accuse Ben of playing the race card or just anybody playing the race card, it's a thing I would say very little. But there is no question that she uses the issue of race and family, by the way, as well, and her own dysfunctional family and everything else involved in that. There is no question that she uses that to gain sympathy. And I think that's harmful to the whole cause of anti-racism. So, I mean, I'm not going to keep silent about one of the main factors involved in that when I was asked to comment on it. Now, what you're doing, although it's, and I don't think it's helpful in this sense, is saying, don't say, I mean, so, okay, maybe you've got to say it, but use another phrase. And I'm refusing to let language be used in that way. Was what I said untrue? The answer is no. It was absolutely true. Was what I could what I said be misinterpreted? Yes, it could. And if you want to go around accusing people of racism, you can do that. Could I have expressed it by saying, instead of playing the race card, she would use the color of her skin as and complain about racism? Well, how is that any different? You know, somebody here suggested, why didn't you just go along with, there was a newspaper here that said she weaponized racism and healthcare. Well, I think weaponizing is a lot worse than playing a card. But listen, we had a question about critical race theory, and I would really like to answer that before we go.
No, that's fine. I'm happy with that pushback, and we'll close it off there. I think we'll make clear our positions on it. So the question.
And thank you, by the way, thank you, and it's good to get that pushback. That's it makes, first of all, it makes your show a whole lot more interesting, and and secondly, it's I mean that's how we learn. This is missing so much from contemporary culture, where people say, well, we can't say what we think. So you think that me using that was wrong. And I say, fair enough. And I think you're wrong thinking it was wrong. And of course, of course, I'm right. And right. And you're an evil scumbag and I'll never talk to you again. You know,
we don't do counseling on this show.
We just disagree. Look, we just disagree about it. And that's fine. And thank you for the pushback.
I think that the thing that's most frustrating is seeing the article get pulled. I found that I was quite disheartened by that, because I'm a big advocate, of freedom and speech, and I think it's just absolutely paramount to preserving everything that's good. I think in not everything. That's too strong, but many of the good things that we enjoy in a sort of liberal society, and to see that reflected so quickly and embraced and celebrated was disheartening, because we shouldn't be replicating what the bad things I think culture is doing, and then Christianizing them. And as much as I might disagree with you on some things and other people, I certainly want the best way to disagree is just, and especially, I'm not saying yours as an example, but of addressing bad ideas is exposing them to challenges and disagreement, and letting people read 2 sides or 3 or 4 sides and coming to an informed conclusion. I think just removing things and pretending they were never said is
I've got a title for a show for you. How about critical thinking?
We're close. We'll stick thinking in between witness and critical.
Critical witness. Yeah, let's go with that. All right.
Cool. So
can we do the 2 questions? Yeah, Peter Byron.
Yeah, we do have 2 questions. So let's get them. We're at an hour and a half, and we don't want to.
You got to
go. I'll do it quickly without mentioning the race card. On you go.
Well, it's about critical race theory to some extent, but I think it provides a solution to this kind of conversation anyway. And I do want to clarify, I'm a big fan of freedom of speech, and I didn't mean to say don't use that phrase. I mean, don't expect things not to blow up if you do use that phrase.
You're right.
More than welcome to use that phrase. It just you might find yourself in some trouble. Here we go. Here's the question. What solution does Christianity offer for opposing and defeating racism, oppression, and abuses of power? The critical theory does not. And why is Christianity's solution better? So again, with the caveat that's in the question, is not to critique critical race theory in itself, but what is the solution that Christianity provides? And I like you put power in that, because I think there is a dynamic we haven't really talked about with the whole interview anyway. There was a power dynamic, and I think you've hinted at it. How does Christianity solve this issue without talking about critical race theory? There we go.
Well, except there is comparing critical race theory as an option. And so therefore, I can't answer the question without mentioning critical race theory, which the big difference between what I'm going to say and critical race theory is first of all, I think critical race theory is false. And secondly, I think it's racist. And I think it will increase racism. And I think so disappointed that so much of the progress that had been made on racism is now being undone by people who say they're anti-racist. But that's part of the chaos that society has fallen into. What Christianity offers is simply this. Professor John Haldane, Roman Catholic philosopher, University of St. Andrews. I heard him once give a lecture on equality. And basically, equality is a non-scientific doctrine of modern society. I'm not equal to Usain Bolt in terms of speed. I'm not equal to you guys in terms of good looks or intelligence. I'm not equal to, there's a whole bunch of things that, how do we get this idea of equality? And the idea of equality comes simply from this. The foundational bedrock of it is that every single human being is made in the image of God. In the old kids' Sunday school chorus, red and yellow, black and white, all are precious in his sight. So I think what Christianity offers is an understanding of humanity. And by the way, I'm pretty sure that I struggle to accept that the concept of race is a biblical one. And I think that the notion that we divide fundamentally by skin color is, to me, absolutely appalling and unbiblical. And it's why I oppose the idea of white churches or black churches or churches according to ethnic groups, because I think that's fundamentally against the New Testament church. So what we offer, I remember one atheist guy coming to me and said, David, he'd been to the church a couple of times. He said, I hate, and I mean it. He said, I hate everything you teach, but I want everything you've got. And he said, I look around your church, and he said, we talk about diversity. You've got it. His atheist society was all white, stale, pale male. We were just a variety of different backgrounds, majority white, because that's the culture in which we lived. But there were people from every continent and every skin color, and living together, united and focused around Jesus Christ. So I would say Christianity must and does offer an answer to racism that the world cannot offer. And all that the world is offering to deal with racism is more racism.
Go on, Dan.
no. So I thought it had paused then.
No, so when I pause, you jump in, because otherwise I'll go for another hour. No,
we're still learning.
But that's listen. That's my answer, guys. I mean, the answer you can't. I remove somebody from my church because they were racist. I regard it as a sin, and a sin that should be disciplined as much as sexual sin or greed or idolatry. It's just wicked, and it's just wrong. I mean, I wrote another piece recently, and it's so interesting because in London and well, in the UK, I tended to get on better in the black majority churches than almost in any other church. I don't know why. But just one of the things was, I just thought, I just genuinely believe that all people are human beings and should not be judged by their skin color. And I find the notion that you judge someone by their skin color just wicked from any side.
Yeah, I think from the Bible, it's a sin of partiality. I think racism falls onto that. I mean, I think we've talked about before with quite a few guests about critical race theory. I think, like you, I tend to agree with you in terms of it worsening racial relations between races, assuming that's a legitimate term to use anyway, because what it does is it presumes that every social interaction, every structure, racism is present. It's not. It asks a fundamentally. It brings a presumption into every interaction. It's not how did racism occur. It's not whether or not racism occurred. It's how it occurred, and that's actually quite a scary assumption to bring into every interaction. Presuming now you have Christians believing that, in the church, actually it's the question is not, has racism occurred? It's how has it occurred? How do we? Yeah, and that is, to me, I just can't see any way that can be helpful and lead to anything other than increased division, not less of it. And I find it scary, because I just think this is horrible. It's a horrible assumption to bring to every interaction, as if when I'm speaking with a darker skinned Christian brother or sister, that they might be, again, not, I don't think most do, but looking at that interaction and seeing and trying to think and mind read about how racism is occurring during this struggle of power, and it's pernicious and horrible. And like you said, the idea of human equality is one rooted in the Judeo-Christian view, but we're riding on the sort of borrowed capital of that idea now, and we're seeing it kind of come to an end, and I don't know, it doesn't look good to me.
No. I'm kind of split on it. So there's two ways. I mean, I work for Friends International, and we're talking about being inquisitive, and my concern side is like, I'm on it with a concern. If there's this assumption of racism, can I be inquisitive? So that natural inquisitiveness about the color of a baby's skin, I've heard the same as you, David. I've heard that's a fairly natural question, and oftentimes babies will come out white and their colors will change as they get older. So it's a hard question to answer anyway. And so the natural inquisitive, can I ask a question about you that might be related to your culture, your ethnicity, even your skin color, out of curiosity, without being labeled a racist? That is a concern, because I work with volunteers who and Brits are horrible at talking about cross-cultural stuff anyway, and walking across cultural lines is difficult enough as it is without the concern of being called a racist, is that we're afraid of offending people anyway. And so this just kind of enhances that. But the other aspect is so that's the concern, and I share it. There's the other aspect of it that I see people responding to critical race theory, to the race card, to the and sort of doubling down as I have the right to speak, I have the right to say this. And I guess where I'm seeing the gospel come into play into this is, well, actually, there's got to be a sense of, dare I say it, laying down some rights, laying down our right to say that, even if it does offend, just saying, look, okay, I hear you. This is, and sort of sharing our concerns in a different way while listening. And I don't know what that looks like yet. I don't have a solution, but the gospel cuts across those lines in a way that I guess those of us in the majority just need to maybe chill out a bit about CRT and humble ourselves a little bit, listen a bit more. And I think, yeah, the gospel is cross-cultural, a beautiful thing, but it's still, there's diversity because we hear the difference. There's different languages, different tribes, different tongues at the throne of God. So there is going to be difference, but there is going to be unity. And I don't see either side, CRT or anti-CRT, I don't see either side getting that right at the moment. I see one's just attacking anything that sounds remotely woke. The other is trying to defend something because they see it as lifting up the oppressed. They see biblical language in CRT.
No, you don't, but you don't have extremes. Now, the point is you're presenting it in such an extreme position. So that's what you do. I mean, it's a standard thing that I would often do in a debate. You present on the one hand this, and on the other hand that, and just drive through the middle. Now, for me, you're asking, what does the gospel do? Well, first of all, the gospel simply tells us, because we are to treat all human beings as made in the image of God. It also tells us that we are to respect one another, and we to do to others as we are to have them do to us, and so on. There's a whole range of different things that apply. It gives us an intellectual basis, a spiritual basis, and it gives us a lot of guidelines. And that's what I would say that we would do. But the trouble is when we start using phrases like the majority. Sorry, who's the majority? I don't feel that I'm part of a majority at all. In fact, I'm very much in a minority. The majority at the moment in our culture, particularly of those who are the opinion formers, are those who put forward critical race theory and its equivalent. And I think critical race theory is a doctrine of demons. I think it's a completely false way of describing things. I think it's fundamentally anti-Christian. I think it brings in division. It brings in hatred. It has a view of history which is just bizarre and ahistorical. And then people say, well, if you disagree with this, you're racist or you're hurting my feelings. I mean, I had a man just before I came in here. It was quite interesting. He was tweeting me about something like this, and he was going on about all this. And I said, well, you're a middle-aged white man, so you're a racist. I'm sorry. And he said, well, no, I'm not. But I said, yes, you espouse critical race theory, which says that. And he says, well, I'm married to a black person. I said, well, that's just paternalism. If you accept the theory, you have to accept that if you're white, you are de facto privileged and racist. And when I contrast someone like Meghan Markle claiming to be a victim of oppression with many of the people in the housing schemes in Dundee, when I think of women who gave up meals, stopped eating for 2 meals a day so that they could feed their kids, and they're white, I'm thinking, no, this is all wrong. I refuse to use the narrative of a society when I've got a biblical narrative which is much, much better. And I'm not going to be, basically, it seems to me that the woke elites, and I will use that phrase because I think it is what it is, and I think it's true, are far more concerned about elitist causes that they can virtue signal on than they are about the poor. And my concern in this is absolutely with the poor. Mm-hmm. So, and now one of the factors involved in that is that there is no question at all that in some areas of London, for example, being particularly Afro-Caribbean meant that you're going to face a whole bunch of issues of poverty that are to do with your skin color. And there's something just incredibly wrong with that. But equally, what about, let's say, in Yale in the US, where if you're Asian, you're discriminated against because you're too smart? You know, and there's a whole bunch of when you do the gospel answer to Peter's question, the gospel answer is a Christian runs 1,000,000 miles from identity politics. 1,000,000 miles. I'm not going there. I refuse to go there. I'm not going to judge someone by an identity that either they claim for themselves or is imposed on them in society when I've got a much deeper identity. And by the way, that goes with sexuality as well. I refuse to judge someone on the basis of their either perceived or passed on sexuality. I mean, when someone comes up to me, as has happened several times, and said, "Hi, I'm John and I'm gay," my response is, "I'm David and I'm not. I guess we're never going to get it on." You know, why did you ask that? You know, why did you say that? Why are you making? So I am not buying into identitarian politics, whether it's racist or not. And where I agree with you, by the way, is I do think your culture and where you're from is actually quite important. You know, I remember a West Indian Baptist pastor in London coming out to my church in the Scottish Highlands, and we absolutely loved him. I mean, there were some church cultural differences, like we had real alcohol in the communion wine, which was a bit of a shock for him, as he nearly choked when he took it. But apart from that, I remember he was asked a question, which now would be deemed a racist question, about marrying someone of a different skin color. And actually, he was very cautious. He said it would be difficult in some circumstances from both sides. And I thought his remarks were wise and were pastoral and realistic. I'm thankful, to be honest, by the way, that I think, this may be wrong, but I think the UK is the #1 country in the world for mixed race marriages, far, far more than the US. And by the way, I do think, I don't want US politics imported here, although it's a bit late.
Agreed.
But I do think that systemic racism in much of US culture is a major issue that the church needs to deal with, because it's within the church. And Obama's comment and numerous other people's comment that we all go to the same baseball game, but we split to go to different churches. To me, that's an absolute abomination. And I've witnessed it and seen it in the southern US. And I'm not disputing it's a serious thing. All I'm disputing is that we divide into these two tribes of either you're woke or you're critical race theory. Sorry, you're either critical race theory and woke, or you're just a far right reactionary to it. I just think Christianity goes a different way.
I think I hope it's coming across that I'm trying to find that middle line. Not that the gospel's the dead center, because I don't think the gospel's going to attack. It's a totally different path, and we've got to recognize that. And so while I share many of the concerns with how far critical race theory can go, I want to caveat that with, I'm also wary of people making it the thing simply by being against it.
Absolutely.
Being known that they're against it. And so there's so much in what you just said that, I'm nodding along going, yeah. There's also this, so it's trying to, and I guess that's the thing with these things, is trying to find that nuance and where the gospel completely cuts across critical race theory, but also there's this wonderful, beautiful picture of all nations coming before the throne of God. And we want to see that. And I'm glad we can agree on, I see systemic racism as a thing, both in states, and I think it's here as well. I don't think maybe not in the same way, but I mean, there's ways it is in education, looking at how people are picked up. But there's a load in there. But that's on other topics, so I won't start that. But I think there's the stuff we can clearly agree on. That all the racism side of things is wrong. We need to
but we also, but instead of just agreeing on it, we need to see what practically can be done about it. So one of the things is simply to recognize, hey, listen, whatever color you are, you can be racist as well. You know, it does happen. And I just think that we're allowing this whole narrative to be dominated by white, Western, liberal, progressive guilt. And I just think we've got to stop that. You know, and this comes back to playing cards. We've got to stop playing cards. What we've got to do is do I mean, we go much deeper, because what you say I agree with. It's a bit like someone who says, I'm anti-abortion, and they don't care for single moms, or they don't, they don't understand that there are some people who will really, really struggle in having another child and need support and help. You cannot be anti something unless you're pro something. And for me, because I'm pro Jesus Christ, and because God created humanity and all the rest of it, I cannot be racist. I mean, I don't know how much I would stress this. If someone in my church was a racist, I would not allow them to be a member of the church, because I would regard that as a deliberate and fundamental sin against the gospel. And I wish that we would, be stronger on these issues. The trouble is when all the time we're just going along with or allowing ourselves to be dictated to by one part of culture. And that is, I'm afraid, more and more what is happening. Guys, was there any other questions? Because I'm going to have to go fairly soon, and I'm sure if there's any listeners left, they must be bored out of their skull with me.
We've had some really good comments, actually, and I think even this one's a nice one. That is phenomenally respectful dialogue with people who clearly greatly disagree. I'm glad that's coming across, that we can remain civil and brothers in Christ in this, and hopefully modeling something we'd like to see more in culture. The last question always is, who should we listen to or read, or maybe your top 3 go-tos for anyone looking for a new book?
All right. No, listen, actually, I'm not, by the way, I'm not sure we profoundly disagree, but that's another
I think there's enough in there to agree with.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't find a profound disagreement. The only thing I think we disagree with, or is the use of my use of the phrase, the race card. And actually, I could be wrong with that. So, it's not the kind of thing I lie awake at night and sleep about, and can't sleep and go, oh dear, And by the way, the other thing, I just need to make this very, very clear. I hate, people culturally, some people struggle with this, but I hate this kind of reading between the lines thing. I say what I think, and that's it. And, I try not to hold grudges against people. Life is too short, and things are far too important in terms of that. And for that reason, the things I would mention in this, I find myself as a Christian appreciating, sadly, I think the Christian church in the West has largely lost much of its backbone. But I find myself listening to gay atheists like Doug Murray, or somebody like Lionel Shriver, Brendan O'Neill. I find them very, very, very perceptive in terms of cultural stuff, although I disagree with a lot of what they say as well. So that's one, if you like, group of people. I think Carl Trueman's latest book, is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And I would, definitely recommend that. It's pretty heavy going, but it's helping us understand the sexual revolution and the transgender thing, but in a much, much deeper way than is usually done. And I think for any Christian, I would definitely go with that. I find newspapers incredibly difficult, because they tend to be just opinion columns now, less news than ever. So I tend to read the likes of the Spectator, who at least allow a variety of opinions and have some intelligent writing within them. So, yeah.
Sounds good.
I don't know. I mean,
haven't you got a new book coming out? Or
well, I did. I am working on a follow-up to the book I did called Ask. I'll tell you the one I will mention. Let me see.
Always growing the book. Go to the We Flee.
2 of them. Yeah, well. That's the Ask one. And you know what amazed me about that was it sold really well. It was written for teenagers, but a lot of adults were getting it. And then I realized why. Because most adults don't want 7,000 word answers to questions, a 700 word answer. And actually, I didn't give an answer. What I did was discussed it and then suggested further reading. So we did everything from suicide to transgender to North Korea to, the Bible within that. So I've had so many responses. I'm doing a follow-up. But I think the one I would most mention is this, that we need to get back to all the time. The answer in terms of critical race theory and all that kind of stuff. I did a thing called Magnificent Obsession, Why Jesus is Great. And just to tell you, Christopher Hitchens wrote a book about God is not great, right? he should have been sued for lying, because the book wasn't about God, it was about religion. And I remember Dinesh D'Souza wrote a response, Why Christianity is Great, and it was the wrong response. That should have been subtitled, Why American Christianity is the Best Thing Ever in the History of the World, because it was a defense of American Christianity. And I thought, no, you've got to write about Christ. So I started doing that, and then I ended up being asked by an atheist, well, why do you believe in Jesus? And you've destroyed my atheism. I thought he was joking, but he wasn't. Or why do you believe in Christianity? And I said, well, actually, I don't. I actually believe in Jesus. And he said, who's Jesus? Now, he had a vague idea. But I just thought one of our big problems in communication is we need to communicate who Christ is. And so I wrote Magnificent Obsession. And for me, that is the absolute key thing. All the things that we discuss will be utterly irrelevant because there is no solution out with Jesus Christ. And I think the solution to racism is Jesus Christ. I think the solution to poverty and disharmony and all the other stuff is there. The people like Jordan Peterson or maybe Peterson's changing, actually. I think he's much closer now than he was. But generally the likes of Doug Murray and so on, is they would be really happy with Christianity without Christ. And the guy I mentioned before who said to me, I want what you've got, at one point he also said to me, David, couldn't we have what you've got without Jesus? And the answer is no. And I think in the big cultural thing right now is that there are people who are trying to build utopia through politics. Politics is their religion. They're trying to build it without Christ, and it will lead to hell on earth. And I think that's the direction that we're going. And our solution to that is not to respond by reacting negatively. So that's where I completely agree about, you don't go critical race theory, therefore, oh, I'm against it. We have to present something that's positive, and we've got nothing that's more positive than Jesus. So that's probably my last word before I go for breakfast.
Yeah, no, we've kept you longer than we'd intended. Dan, have you got any last words?
No, that was good. I've actually got your Ask book on my Amazon wish list. I haven't got around to getting it yet, but I've read all your other books. I've read Magnificent Obsession. That was the response to Hitchens, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I look forward to getting the Ask, but it sounds more interesting now. I'm a big fan of short books now. All right. Yeah, it does look better on Goodreads when you've read more books. Yeah. Yeah.
We could have a competition, you know. I've read 3 books on critical race theory, by the way. I don't think I've read any against.
That's more than a lot of critics. I find that's a bugbear for another day.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've read any against, so maybe I should. But anyway,
if you read the pros and then you can kind of critique it yourself, then that's all good. Yeah. Right. Thank you, David. Thank you so much for extra time, and I realise we've had a healthy discussion, and really appreciate what you're doing. And I did also appreciate Dawkins Letters when I read that back in the day. So if you haven't, and if you're listening to this, get Dawkins Letters, go back in time a little ways, and then see how things have moved on from those new atheist heydays. So thank you, David. I'll just close things up. Just a big thanks to our Patreon supporters who have helped us to make sure we can pay for some equipment, and for StreamYard. If you'd like to join us on patreon.com, you can find us at Critical Witness. And thanks for joining us. Thanks for your comments and your questions. Our next show is actually early next week with Peter Williams, who I believe it's the Peter Williams on Can We Trust the Gospels? Am I right, Dan?
Yes,
that is the right Peter Williams.
Peter J.
Not the other one. They're both great.
They're both great. So join us, ask us questions about the Gospels, resurrection, that kind of stuff, and I'm sure Peter J. Williams will be happy to answer those questions. It will be on Tuesday, but no, it's not. It's Monday night. Join us on Monday night, and I'm going to stop here because it's 11:30 and I'm starting to ramble. Have a very good night. Hope you enjoyed the show. Bye-bye.